As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
The other big part of this is that misinformation, disinformation happens locally. It's a problem locally, but it's also a problem globally. And it's also become sort of the portfolio for irregular warfare. It's always been, but now because of this digitally scaled and technology scaled information environment, you have nations that are at odds with each other, and they're really having effect. They don't have to put a single traditional weapon system on the ground because they can play Dungeons and Dragons with each other's population.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to today's episode of the Security Nexus webinar titled Bolstering Resilience and Restoring Trust in the Information Environment. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired, and professor here at DKI APCSS. In today's digital age, the information environment surrounds us, influencing our decisions, shaping our worldviews, and impacting our societal bonds. This environment where human cognition meets technology and content is pivotal to our everyday lives, yet it faces unprecedented challenges. Misinformation and disinformation have become rampant, eroding trust in our foundational institutions and complicating the pursuit of truth. As traditional information governance models struggle to keep pace with these changes, the battle for influence in what we see, hear, and ultimately believe intensifies. Amid this turmoil, we must advocate for an information environment that upholds truth, fosters critical thinking, and cultivates resilience. Today, we delve into questions central to the integrity of our democratic life. How do we combat disinformation while upholding freedoms? Can faith in institutions be restored, or must we seek new pathways to credibility? How do we equip future generations to navigate this complex landscape? To navigate these questions, we're joined by Professor Beth Kunce from DKI APCSS, whose vast experience spans improving race relations to spearheading digital strategies and international humanitarian efforts. Beth, welcome.
Thank you, James.
Your story is an amazing one. You and I have had many opportunities to talk, and I want you to just share a little bit with the audience what brought you here and the experiences that you've had that help shape your perspective on the information environment.
Okay. Sure. The last 25 years I have spent working sort of in the nexus between security actors and civilians in crisis settings, whether it was race and police community relations or working in international disaster response. In all of these settings, information, liaison arrangement, building trust and relationships and understanding in advance of dealing with crisis situations was critical to be able to work effectively as a community and overcome and recover from the different challenges that we face. So when we were presented with COVID and we saw and we're working, all of us in this space, how much the information environment was shaping the effectiveness of this response and what was happening in society in terms of polarization and how people were interacting and relating with each other.
Right.
That's when we sort of got tasked, and I worked with Dr. Miyamoto and Mary Markovinovich, and there's been different folks on our team, and Dr. John Hemmings early on as well, to start really having a discussion with the many stakeholders of what's going on, and how do we start pulling apart and understanding what's really happening in this information environment, where we had spent, and years ago when we thought avian influenza was going to kick off, I was working on a lot of plans, and we had done all this work to be prepared for a pandemic. But the information environment and the information that was going through and the lack of trust and the polarization in community really undermined globally this response, right? So this is where we started looking at, and we got to be part of this kind of ongoing effort for the last 3.5 years, where we've been working with different actors, international lawyers from the human rights, international humanitarian law, human security experts that have contributed and helped write the UN Development Report, and looking at different folks that have been looking at the information ecosystem, looking at military folks who have always been thinking about this, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, folks from the different social media platforms, the trust and safety and all of that. And in this time, we have realized that there are some fundamental truths in this space. And maybe what we're focused on a lot of the time is sort of the back end, and we need to look more as a disaster framework in some ways, in a risk reduction framework, in a human security lens, rather than traditional security, because we don't want the problem itself to reside squarely in traditional security architecture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. That's fascinating. I think I knew a lot of what you said, but I think your degree of involvement transcends what I had even considered when we spoke about coming onto the show. But I know we've got the right person here. So let's
That's something.
isn't it? I want to talk a bit about the evolving information landscape. I have been watching this been engaged in it for some time, just as a participant or just as a consumer. But I mean, this technological influence on the information environment, I mean, it has reshaped power dynamics and governance, presenting us with challenges and opportunities. So here's the question. What strategies are most effective for enhancing security and social resilience in response to these technological shifts?
Okay, so I think before we start talking about strategies and approaches, we really need to understand the scale of harm that we're dealing with. And I think that one of the challenges is that we look at this problem set. There's that story of the 6 blindfolded men and the elephant, right? But we take that, apply it to what Joseph Nye calls the multidimensional chessboard with the diffusion of power, complex system where things are always evolving, changing. There's no fixed kind of distribution of power understanding. And this is the information environment that we're dealing with, right? When we are not communicating with each other, we're bifurcated in how we look at global security. So we have this domestic sort of home game structure, and then we have the away game, right? And the information environment that we exist in, our identity, and this is why I think human security lens and looking at that is a critical part of this, is that when we are looking at the effects, there's one human security professor expert that we consulted with and worked with. His name's Oscar Gomez. And when he looked at this, and this was the first time he was sort of looking at disinformation through a human security lens, he goes, this is a multisectoral disruptor. Actually, the way that this information environment has been scaled by technology, it's changing how we understand our reality. And the power of influence, this third face of power that's always been part of, when you look at international relations theory, this, influence, getting people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, is become such a big part, and it's gone on to steroids. So when you and I were talking about, well, what's changed, right, in this whole space? Right now, think about it as, if we were talking about traditional use of force and we're in a fight, right, and for effect, right, you have your fist, you have a sword, then you move to black powder rifle, then you move to Gatling gun, and then you move to nuclear weapons, right? In the information environment, right, we've gone through these transitions, and arguably, communication, written, then digital to this space. Are we at the space where we're at nukes right now in terms of what the potential effects are? And it moves very rapidly. So we talk about elections. A lot of the discussions are framed around democracy or authoritarian, which style of government, that's fine. But our actual existence in the information environment, how much of our personal information and security is wrapped up in that, how people perceive or understand us, our personal safety, people's access to us, bias, cognitive bias that we're not even aware of and we're being controlled by, and the algorithms, and that's where the AI and all of this fits into, is that it starts fueling these things and puts them on steroids for effect that are profound, which is what we saw during COVID, right? And that we couldn't get people to take vaccines, and that we saw people fighting in the streets, and we see all of these things happening. So the information environment is almost, we're at this, when I talk to the humanitarians, I think about it as Henry Dunant, when the International Humanitarian Law and Geneva Conventions were born, saw the scale of harm to civilians. And that's where we're at this critical juncture. And I think that what we're seeing with the information environment, we are seeing also this level of existential crisis where there is harms, there's Wild West, and there is not, we need folks like the ICRC, we need folks like Médecins Sans Frontières who will advocate and protect civilians. This is not the domain of traditional defense. It's kind of a whole spectrum of things. It's a whole of society. And at the individual, it's almost an existential crisis on multiple levels because we are part of the solution. We are part of the problem.
Indeed.
To the global level. So we are at this very interesting time where the information environment is arguably where we're spending most of our existence and how we relate and interact with each other and how that's shaped by artificial intelligence and bias and damage that's already pre-existing because of bad information or biased information or manipulation. We don't even know yet. We haven't really done a full-on assessment of what our starting point is and how do we team around this problem set in a way that fills those gaps and seams that we're seeing.
Okay, so you have done a good job of helping us think. Maybe we're all scared now, but you've helped us think a larger, broader, more complex environment than maybe some of us came here today thinking. But as we think through the complexities of what you've talked about, I mean, we need to think about a balancing of our risks, as well as the rights that we have. And so when we think about that, I mean, misinformation lies at the heart of this tension between this risk management and human rights within the informational environment. And so that being the case, here's the question for you. I mean, what approaches best balance these concerns, particularly when we think about safeguarding human rights, I guess, against this misinformation risks?
I don't think there's a one right size or a one model that fits all. I think that there's a framework that's been established, and I've spoken to you about the Internews Information Ecosystem Assessment Tool, and we've consulted repeatedly with their experts and asked for, information and had them participate in discussions and dialogue. And then they're extraordinary in this tool in terms of if you're military, thinking of like a JIPO to do an assessment of the information environment. So understanding and assessing the information environment, where, the production of information, the consumption of information, the trust, where trust resides, influence, and control, right? Because that's the other thing. This is part, you're right. The risk is huge. We don't quite understand it yet because a lot of it's second, third order effect too. So you could put something in like what we saw with the elections, in the Internet Research Agency. You can put something into the information environment and then it takes flight. But where do you hold responsibility, right? In these things, when you have this kind of it lily pads and takes shape and morphs. It's sort of a cancer that spreads, right? So you have this tool. We need to refine and get something greater that we can look at that covers the private sector. It covers the state and the state's responsibilities and obligations to the human rights of people, how the information environment affects each of these parts of our life and our rights that are through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights outlined in the UN Charter, and what are a state's obligations to ensure and protect those. What we're seeing is, and what we saw in COVID, is a lot of action and fear and quick things made to control. And it say we're in the name of protecting you, right, from bad information. And that's actually controlling access to information. So this is something that we don't necessarily rush into. We don't have a full picture. The EU has been actively making a lot of progress, both with artificial intelligence and digital services, and looking at how do we start trying to come together and come up with some frameworks and solutions for this. One of the other top experts that we consulted with now, who has moved, she was over at Chatham House, is Kate Jones, who is an international human rights lawyer, and she wrote a very good 2019 paper on looking at how, discourse on disinformation and
Yep.
misinformation, freedom of speech does not ensure freedom of reach, right? So this is where the effects are, and how do we start measuring this? And what's the boundaries? What's the concept of harm? We have precedents in international humanitarian law with incitement, which is what we saw with the radio station in Rwanda and genocide, hate crimes and hate speech, right? But how do we start looking at that? We also have civil litigation, right? So you've got things like, you've got these marketing you've got accountability for harms to people from marketing strategies that were deception and all of these things. You've got the sugar industry that was saying, don't eat fat, but they were like, they wanted to suppress the stuff that was actually like the sugar industry's poison, right? So there's all of these legal foundations, there's all these bodies of law, there's all of these different elements, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's information, disinformation. There's the bridge between. The other big part of this is that misinformation, disinformation happens locally. It's a problem locally, but it's also a problem globally. And it's also become sort of the portfolio for irregular warfare. It's always been, but now because of this digitally scaled and technology scaled information environment, you have nations that are at odds with each other, and they're really having effect. They don't have to put a single traditional weapon system on the ground because they can play Dungeons and Dragons with each other's population. Yeah. And we need to untangle that. And that's been a big focus. And that's where we have this resident with Department of Defense and, Ministry of Foreign Affairs or State Department or whatever, really looking at this. But at the end of the day, that focus is still on the away game. It's still on this macro level interaction between nation states. And what we really need to get at is that these fights and all of this stuff in this scaled information environment is happening by, with, and through the population. Yeah. And they are not tracking. We don't have our arms wrapped around it yet, but they don't understand how much of their day-to-day life is being manipulated by these different actors. And we need to start getting to more of the public health aspects of this, where it creates depression, it creates all of these harms in terms of, even safety, because some of the demonization of population, some of these things that are going out as misinformation can lead to violence, right? Yeah, of course. And so we have, this is where I've gone on a little bit of a tangent. We have from local to global, and we need to find the bridge in the body of law in some of these frameworks, test them out, have more dialogues, both at a multilateral level, which the UN is starting to do and the EU is starting to do. ICRC is sort of bound in their IHL space, and they're looking at how this scales in conflicts. They've got some great work. There's I'm going to forget his name, so that's why I printed this here. Tillman Rodenhauser has written a lot about psychological operations and where some of these frameworks and where some of these new spaces fall. And then some of the folks like from Medicine Sans Frontières and other ICRC digital technology experts have been looking at how this affects the civilian population in harms. But that doesn't bridge to day-to-day domestic, where a lot of this is happening. So we have to figure out where that line is and how we start interpreting law and getting a legal review so that we can build some maybe agencies and organizations with missions and mandates to help support and protect a more resilient society in these spaces.
I'm going to pull us forward into that area of legal framework. But before I do, I think I want to delve a little bit further into, you use, rightly so, and I did in the opening, terms of misinformation and disinformation. Yeah. And you talked about using, the populist by, with, and through, and I think of some of it is, misinformation, clickbait, where I want to be able to generate clicks on a social media site and so I put something that maybe the byline is not, is not nearly, is more insightful than what's in the context of the.
Got to make it sexy.
I got to make it exactly right. I got to make you click onto there, and so my motivation may be a little less nefarious, other than wanting to get you to click on something that may or may not be right, and that was really nice, and they pass it around to everybody else. But you fill the information environment with that type of information, and it gets clogged, right? But then there is disinformation, which is actually intended to do something more nefarious, right? Perhaps try to send a message, try to go ahead, take it further.
Well, I mean, there's the different types and tactics, and some is benign or unintentional. And then some is with intent to create division or for strategic effect over your enemy, so to speak. I think when we start talking about these things, and you're talking about the clickbait, and you're talking about the purpose, and you're talking about, well, when do these things get traction, right? We get to the cognition. So what's the processor for the information? So right now, the scale of the information environment, the amount of information that we are subjected to is extraordinary, right? Because of this digital environment. But there are also some blind spots in the world where they don't have access. So there's this inequity, right? Cognitively, and looking at neuroscience, and this is where with cognitive warfare, and NATO's really leaning in on this, and we all should be. But this isn't a military. This is not just a military thing. This is something that every sector of society should be looking at and understanding, that their operational effectiveness and their ability to do their job will largely be shaped by the information environment, and how much the content in the information that their success relies on is manipulated or shaped or distributed in this information ecosystem, right? And that's something that it's all of our problem. But the cognitive space is that when you read more and more of the neuroscientists and what they have to say about this, is that really we're lazy, right? By nature we are trained or taught to
take the easiest path.
We pick the easiest path, what we've already been told, what reinforces what we already think believe, right? And so this is the state of nature, right? And traditionally, we had sources of information that we could go to that could help us get some, somewhat reliable information that was developed with a code of ethics under traditional journalism code of ethics. I think there's like 400 code of ethics for journalism. And we had a place to go that would help us. We had these traditional sources of information, and that would help us somewhat, I think, when with our laziness, at least have access to good information. Now, the media industry and code of ethics for media has become largely infotainment. The local mom and pop news stores have been just obliterated, right? And just there's so much that has been destroyed, where that was kind of an anchor for us to consume information. And now the context that used to be part of the news is now international audiences come in, and or international production. So they don't have the context, and they may end up causing problems and reinforcing some of the bad information without knowing it. And then most people are consuming their information on social media, and there is no vetting, there is no standard of conduct. It's the Wild West. It's like going into the Star Wars bar to get your information, right?
It is. I mean, it used to be that the news that people cared most about was what was happening locally. But if there's been an evisceration of the local journalism that's going on, then it's hard to get that.
It's very hard to get that. And the media is gone. And we're also, again, in this very challenging time, and Collins Dictionary said that we're in a state of permacrisis, right? So we teach this all the time here at APCSS. So we have this global pandemic, we've got environmental security, we've got climate change, we have got 1 in 73 people are displaced right now. 25% of the world is living in conflict-affected areas. We have pushing on 10% of the world's population living in extreme poverty, which is less than $2.15 a day. And we are seeing all of these stressors. We're in a constant state of crisis, multiple layers of crisis, where things, are more impactful. Anything that gets put into this, we're in this vulnerability, this state of constant vulnerability and exposure, that there will be significant effect, right? And so when you are a leader in this space, there's a lot of how are you going to choose to lead in this space? Are you going to blame others? Are you going to hit the easy button and rule with fear, or lead with fear and blame, and say that you have control over the situation, right? Or are you going to own that we are in complex times?
Yeah.
And that we really need to say, yeah, we're all afraid. There's a lot of unknowns. Things are changing very rapidly. And how are we going to handle that? And that's where it comes to, because one of the things that with all of this, when we get to this overload of information, we have all of this fake. So it's all of this fact checking. It's this, let's do this. But with our cognitive biases, right? Our already how we understand the world is pretty set. We have to stop being lazy, and we have to be able to reach outside and own our biases and be able to spread beyond. We have to get out of our agency, our silos, our different sectors that we're in, and start seeing the whole elephant and start taking some more of those bites. Because as an individual, as a voter, as a person that has responsibilities as a citizen of my country, that's my responsibility, is not to blame, but to take ownership within my community and reach out and say, James, give me your hand. We're part of the same beloved community.
Yeah, so I think you're right. And yet I've come to realize that without a disorienting dilemma in one's life, change is tough. Or stated differently, people don't change without a reason to change. And that reason is tough to come by. It is, as I said, this disorienting dilemma. But I want to let's pull a minute on some of the things you talked about. Fear, you talked about uncertainty, frankly, these things are an erosion of trust. And so then we find ourselves in this issue that I think I want to pivot on a little bit, is about governance and accountability. And so with this erosion of trust and accountability, I mean, it poses a significant governance challenge. And so are there, and you alluded to a little bit earlier, but maybe you would just pull on this more, the specific frameworks that you've seen that are successful to address these issues. So you've created what is, frankly, I mean, it's clarity to what's happening. It is, in your words, a bit of the Star Wars bar, and we're going
Wild West.
Wild West.
Yeah.
How do we enhance governance and restore confidence to all of this?
There's a lot. What's really interesting, I think this is when I was going back and I was working with race and police community relations, and then working in a lot of these wicked problems where you have so many actors that are critical stakeholders working in a very urgent, chaotic operational space. You will have the used car salesman coming in with their silver bullet solution, right? And that, we can track all of these things, and we can tell you, and then we'll do these critical thinking exercises, or this, that, or the other thing. And it's very linear. It's very into a small element of society, and it is not comprehensive. The truth is that a lot of the damage has already been done in this space, right? And so we're so polarized that we're not able to effectively communicate. So it's not just critical thinking. The part that's really missing from a lot of this discussion is, how do we effectively communicate and function as society? Because right now we're in debate club. We've got all these bubbles. This is like the the PsyOps guys that I've worked with that are the experts in this. They talk about how there's just boop, 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 bubbles of we start getting really tribal and entrenched in these truths. And they're incompatible with each other. We're not able to problem solve. We're all part of the same community, geographically living and sharing from the same resources, but we are not able to come together and see our common interest in functioning together and being. And so the further polarized we are, the more of a target we are. So this is like the feedback loop when we start looking at what our traditional national security's interests should be, and looking at how are we getting community building and peace building and communication and critical thinking skills into our schools, and getting our Department of Health and Safety engaged and involved, and having relationships and things like I mean, when I worked on the Race and Police Community Relations Commission, I worked for a civil rights leader. And my God, I learned so much from him in nonviolence and meeting all of these amazing people when our country was so polarized. And I think the US is such a great example. And I worked for him for about 3.5 years as his right hand, Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr., sitting down with all those people, the people that in the news and in the coverage, you think they hate each other's face, right? And that they're absolutely cannot sit down and break bread and hold each other's kids on their lap and whatnot. It's building those relationships. It's coming and creating space for that dialogue. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now, particularly with the younger generation, is a lot of cancel culture. So their idea of success in critical thinking is to stop conversation, right? And I would argue when my old boss got his skull cracked open and was arrested 30 times during the civil rights movement, the very least I can do as a white woman is sit down and stick around for uncomfortable conversations, right? And this is the stuff, these are the models, getting more of what we saw. Tom Ricks, and I was talking about this earlier, wrote Waging the Good War. So this is not dealing with the information environment per se, but the effects of the information environment and the polarization that we're seeing. We need to see people coming together to start building those bridges and start addressing some of these issues that we're seeing as challenges. And it could be climate change. It could be race and police community relations. It could be any topic that we're seeing social fissures in what people are targeting. How are we bringing people together to start building trusting relationships across, and there's new actors involved, the folks in these social media platforms, the folks in the private sector, and you know, now that we've got the social media, there's all these mental health effects and a lot of the things that we're seeing and how it's affecting our children, right? So we need to start teaming around that and having community-based solutions and dialogues, getting universities and getting students need to pick up and start, the youth need to pick up and start leading. You know, these folks during the civil rights movement, they were 18, 19 years old when they started doing this, and they led our nation back from a really, really dark place. Yeah. We didn't get all the way there, but it's still complex and we're still working through these issues. But we're seeing a lot of the world also fall to very dark governments and seeing a lot of people having to resist very brutal, abusive governments. And so what we really need to do is focus on how do we start pulling back when we're seeing such polarization, we're seeing such dangerous trends for all of our governments and for all of our personal stability and well-being. How do we start and it's going to be at the very local level. It is at the individual level. It's, and this is where I get into more of my woo-woo stuff in the meditation, but it's mindfulness. It's a lot of not being so reactionary, not being drawn into the fear. It's taking a breath. I mean, it's a lot of the stuff, ironically, that SOCOM spent money on and sort of developing the force, these skills and the breath techniques and all of these other things that we've learned how to do to be as individuals resilient are things that we need our children to learn, and we need to make all of society. This is part when we're dealing with a very there's not this human interaction, there's not this nonverbal communication, there's not the tone of my voice, there's not it's this urgent bad information overwhelming all of us at the time. How do we process that in a way that is not reactive, and we're able to stop, think, and figure out, okay, this is how you're seeing this, how am I seeing this, and communicate with each other and work through things.
You've touched on so many of the things. No, I think, I mean, at the core, or at least at the beginning, you spoke about degrees of education. You spoke about children learning and talked about us learning at universities. Certainly, we've been teaching this, understanding the information environment better. We've been teaching that here for a few years now. Not as long as I've been here. We weren't teaching it at any degree when I came here 8 years ago. We teach at a much higher level. But to your larger point, At what point in school are we teaching these things? When should we start doing it? The community, and then when you think about community involvement or the type of information or educational campaigns. My mind was, when you're speaking about that, my mind was going back to Schoolhouse Rock and how effective that was years ago, but it was extremely effective at being able to try to shape and teach message about civics and involving in those areas or other things. When you spoke earlier about information and where we get it, I thought, well, I remember decades removed that pretty much it was available on 3 networks, and people tuned in the evening and listened to it, or commonality of newspapers, and yet those days are so far gone. That while it may be daunting, the task in front of us, I think your point of there is at its core a necessity for communities that live together to come together to be able to begin the efforts there. But then certainly government holds a place in here to try to help weave this through. And I'm reminded of your comments, and this is it's global. And whether or not this is used to exacerbate fear or whether there's an effort to try to ameliorate concerns. One can argue, depending on where you're at, how that approach is taken. But at its core, for government's involvement, whether it's national governments or multinational or these things, there are legal frameworks that can help. And you even address some that have been taken, and you can argue, or I think I would, that European countries maybe are on the leading edge of some of these right now. But adapting our legal and normative frameworks, is crucial to rapidly evolving this landscape to get in front of this. And so then I think I'd ask you this question. Maybe you might share some examples of practical legal adaptations that have addressed the complexities of this information environment. And then, because those examples maybe help us think about where we might find future hope.
I think this is something we're all struggling to straddle this. So there's bits of it, like the EU's dealing with AI and they're dealing with digital services. If we're looking at traditional security in a frame of it, this straddles cyber warfare, irregular warfare, cognitive warfare. It is this kind of, it fits into all of these frameworks. So we'd have to figure out how does this look in that space, and what is the law of armed conflict, and where do we? So we have that, but then you have a criminal aspect to it as well, and then you have undue influence, right, in terms of manipulation and sales and all of these other things. So there's this, and then there is domestic sort of frameworks and regulation, and more on the front end, sort of the risk reduction. I think one of the things that I had been able to be part of and observe and support different elements just through the work that I've done the last 20 years out here is that the way that we handled globally international disaster risk reduction with the Hyogo framework for action that happened, that the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction happened a week after the December 2004 tsunami.
Yep.
And from that came the Hyogo framework for action, which was a framework for priorities for action for nation states to kind of come together with a strategy, a national strategy or plan to deal with disaster risk reduction. And I think there was that, and concurrent with that, the International Federation of the Red Cross, which deals with disaster response in the national societies and sort of convening body and sort of manages and looks at natural disasters. They ran point on an international legal review of applicable international law for disaster response.
Mm.
And so what I think, and this is one of the things when we consulted with all these experts from this is because it's such your head explodes a million times talking about it. As you've seen all the tangents I go on, there are so many different aspects of society that touches this. We need to get an international legal review of what law is applicable and what are kind of the left and right parameters are. And I used to call it, and I got my, hands slapped. I called it, we need to come up with a good guys playbook, but I guess that's an antiquated, I'm not allowed to use it, but we need to know what right looks like, basically, right? So that will help us all kind of shape, because each state and each population, it's going to be different in how you shape around that based upon the context and culture and all these other things. But we need something that gives us, with the normative frameworks, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Charter, international, covenants. Also, the other big part of this that has to be present in how we look at in the Ruggie principles in terms of looking at the role of the private sector, because they're driving a significant amount of this. And to some degree, we are way too much being like, yeah, okay. They're like, well, this is what feels right for us. And we're like, I'm sorry, but I want Medicine Sans Frontières to get in their face and make sure and hold them accountable that we are doing right by our people, because it's not about profit, and they should not be driving this space. And traditionally, the private sector, having worked in human trafficking and labor trafficking before, they get away with far too much. And we need to really, when they are driving this space, that also challenges state authorities and things that states should be able to protect their citizens from. If the private sector, just by the power of this technologically driven information environment, is holding a lot of that, what can states do to continue to protect their populations?
And so do you see that there's, proactive efforts in some areas to protect the citizens that you're referring to?
Not enough.
Not enough.
Not enough. I think we need a surge in rabble rousers. We need people reading Gene Sharp. We need people referencing the Einstein Institute, looking at Peter Ackerman and looking at strategic nonviolent history.
Yeah.
And we're looking at that, and we're seeing a lot of that in Ukraine with resistance. But we need it on, and I almost hate to use this term because people are talking about resilience, and it's sort of like, it's like stabilization, like, 10 years ago, and all of us have a reaction to that. Resilience can go from cognitive to, the resilience of this structure in this building to, my health, one of my elements. It can be a million different things, but this is what we need to focus on in terms of our community and society and how we function, how we problem solve, and start looking at what is that, not just whether our elections are resilient. How are our people working together and getting along? We're seeing a lot of the wheels are getting wobbly.
They are, and there's, where you touch this, so you can certainly talk about it. But trust in the information is part of the problem. Is there's a deficit of it. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so so what can be done?
Well, and that's huge, right? So that's the thing. Like every presentation, I pretty much am like, the Edelman Trust Barometer. Did you guys know about the Edelman Trust Barometer? And none of you, as traditional institutions of governance, you're not trusted, right? And that's where we're at. We're at this what they call the information bankruptcy, right? And so that's our starting point, right? And the other thing is because of our cognitive bias, right? Like, have you noticed if you say anything, and how polarized, even just in the US it is, if you say something and somebody associates it with a political party or a certain type of argument, they shut down.
Yeah. And
they won't listen to you because they've already decided that you and I do not see eye to eye, and our conversation will go no further.
Yeah. No.
And so how do we stay through the uncomfortable and have conversations, say, no, I just said that, but you had this reaction. Let's talk about that, because I really want to get to the other side of this. We don't have to agree, but we live in the same community, and this is something we're all facing, right? And there are ways to do that. There are people that are teaching skills, and that's why, with the books that I am recommending and some of the things is this problem, when we start scaling it and we start really talking big, we're waiting for frameworks and we're waiting to see what the EU does. Maybe our leadership in different areas and our domestic and international facing security architecture need to start coming together and figuring out how skills and capabilities can be and liaison arrangements, information sharing, things, what does security look like now in these new realities? But also we really need to empower our population, which is part of the UN's Summit for the Future in September, is looking at how do we, they're saying, since World War II, the security architecture that was established isn't fit for purpose for what we're doing. It's not working. So how do we prepare youth for the reality they're inheriting? Because perhaps how we're educating them isn't sufficient or applicable to the reality in the world that they're inheriting. What is the digital environment? What is the regulation of the framework for that? And they're working on that. Security Council, well, that's another whole webinar, isn't it? These are the things.
Yeah, the effectiveness of it in its present state. But I think you're at its core. Yes, I would agree. And when I think about the responsibility that people have, individuals have, and you would ask yourself, if I am ultimately the front line at trying to, to prevent the propagation of misinformation, disinformation, what would you tell people to do? What might they do that might make a difference in this space?
So I'm going to just a practical thing just based upon some of the work that I've done in the past. I would call up people I'd call up Megan, who's a Jedi and one of the smartest people I know in the world, Megan Reynard Gale, in the information ecosystem and humanitarian stuff. Then I would call up one of the folks that I used to work with law enforcement, who was on this Race and Police Community Relations Commission, who is now working community-oriented policing services for the Department of Justice. Then I would call up my friend Tenny, who is the head of this Nonviolent Institute in Chicago. And then I'd call up some Council of Churches folks that I know, some NAACP folks I know, some folks that are representing the Republican Democratic Party in different states, and try to get people together and start talking, because we have elections coming up. Things are wildly polarized. And if we start having conversations and building bridges and start talking about this, and the folks that actually know how to take and build peace and build trust and have conversations and respond and react when incidents happen and are able to help work together to diffuse, to show, which is what we used to do. We would have a united front if there was a shooting, right? It's powerful when you have the stakeholders that are supposed to represent the different entities that are supposed to hate each other, right? Working together to keep their community safe. So these are the practical things that I would say, let's start doing that. Let's bring that out. Start building it into the information environment. Stop having people spend all of their interaction, which is being driven by clickbait and pushing people further into divisive territory through this AI, and get people to start having some working groups that represent these different. Don't let political parties be lazy and act like this is World Wrestling Entertainment and that it's debate club, because your job is actually to work together.
Yeah.
And you're terrible models when you're not.
Listening to you sounded like you were forming the core of a resilience effort in a community or wherever. You brought the smart people together, both sides or multiple sides of interest areas or political parties, to sit down and to think about collectively how you build a more resilient community where you're at. Have you seen anything like that work?
I worked on that. That's with Race and Police Community Relations and the commission that I worked on. And then I got to see police officers getting trained in Kingian nonviolence and going out with community leaders, with the direct action community activists, and helping sit in rooms. We have models of this. We've done this before. Problem is that we're letting other people tell us whether it works or not, or we're not engaging with each other. And there is ways to do this, and that's exactly what it is. There are definitely, through the stuff that I worked with years ago with the Department of Justice, and this Tenny Gross, who's just a legend in nonviolence work in Chicago. Decades ago, he did this street workers program, which was one of the model practices, and it would put people out and work, and they would be, keeping the streets safe, and this relationships across different stakeholders in the community, having folks get in police cars together after we have a lunch or a commission meeting, and we're joking around. There are things like this that have happened. The gang football league, having the gang unit belay for the kids that are rock climbing. We let people tell us stories about how these relationships are, or how these groups of people are. They're not true. They're based on what you've heard, and that is lazy. And that's where it's an individual responsibility for us to get out of the stories that we're told about groups of people. And it is our responsibility to keep our population safe, to ask questions, and to hold our government accountable. Right now, a lot of these changes, people, and understandably, things are overwhelming right now, but we need to do better at educating the public of how much the realities change, and how do they get their agency and power and make good choices in this space. Or, you can use this as the information environment for good, or you can keep further, feeding the hate. And so we have to figure out what that looks like. And then again, it's like, in the digital environment, how do we build trust? How do we show love and kindness and humanity in the digital space? We're seeing a lot of hate. And that's where I love Brene Brown. I love me some Brene Brown. One of the things that she says is that fear is contagious, but so is courage, and that's a skill that can be learned, right? So how do we take that and apply that to the information environment? And these are some of the things that I think that they're practical skills, they're conversations that we can have. It's not some big, sexy, grand, malign influence strategy and all this stuff. But my care, as I'm a tree hugger, I go to the human rights and the civil rights space. That's what I do. I rabble rouse, coalition build, and all that. And what I want to see is, how do we get some strategies to do the people power? Because that's going to be what will save. When people say they want to save democracy, that will save democracy.
Your examples are all from very difficult issues. And so that's encouraging. I mean, you've seen it working at levels and other complex problem sets. Is encouraging to think about applying those types of approaches here. I think before we go to questions from the audience, I think I want to pull real quickly on this last piece that you spoke about, which was accountability, holding government and governments and perhaps other very large corporations accountable. It's necessary, but how do we do it?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is something where you got to keep my inside voice inside. I think it is one of the challenges is that it's not by nature something that profit-making industries want to give up their maneuver and their ease with which they can make profits, right? And we're seeing progress, and I think I look a bit to international labor laws, right? And trafficking and forced labor and exploitation, and how that's been very difficult to regulate. And I think that when we're looking at Facebook and some of the precedents that we're seeing and the power that they have, I think that's why it's so critical to have this international legal review. Because arguably our existence in our everyday life, which then becomes an issue of governance, it's not just about consumer, it's about our existence, is a much larger legal landscape. And that is where we really do need the most brilliant legal minds to come together. And it's insufficient to box things out into human rights law and to international humanitarian law when different actors, whether nation states or not, are able to lily pad boundaries or skip over and create significant harm. So I think until we actually get something, and that's a bit what the UN is looking at. I don't think it's sufficient. What they're trying to achieve is, hey, it's ringing the bells. It's like, hey guys, there's these huge gaps and seams. This needs to happen, right? This is all part of it. But we really need, and there's so many things going on in the world with these 3-meter target crises that we're dealing with. But this is sneaking up on us. And until we get this kind of comprehensive look at this multidimensional chessboard and what that has done to governance with the diffusion of power and how different actors have been empowered to dangerous effect of this traditional Westphalian system.
I want to take us here in the last few minutes. I want to do really a lightning round of just a few questions from the audience. First one, and some of these sound a little bit familiar, but it's indicative of what they're asking and wanting to pull more on. So trust maintenance. So quickly, how can we maintain trust online in an environment that's saturated with misinformation and disinformation? Online trust.
Have real relationships with the people that are represented in the conversations. And then we really do need to figure out what that type of, how do we start having some quality relationships if possible in the online space. So that's another part that we're going to have to develop because we have to raise our children in this. We got to figure this out.
Oh my goodness, they're on there a lot. AI inclusion. Does the information environment include AI?
Yes, I mean, that's it. And AI is having profound effect. And so the fact that we have all of these bias and all of these narrative, I mean, people talk about narrative warfare and all of these things that are pushing different agendas or pushing for, just different things that are polarizing. Well, artificial intelligence, the algorithms only fuel.
Oh, it's going to fuel
that. So, and then it becomes more and more divisive and then people become more entrenched. So it's the significant amplifier. Yeah.
False news, counteracting it. What can we do?
There's no one silver bullet. There's, it's got to be an all hands on deck approach of people talking to each other, people reining in their own behaviors, right? We have to be, you cannot be demonizing each other and then expect to have any credibility. And I'm talking about all nations and the political parties in these nations that are just demonizing each other using all sorts of, yet they want us to trust them when they behave like that during a pandemic, right? Yeah. So this is bringing people together. It's critical thinking skills. It's awareness raising. It's all of these things. Fact checking is nice if you want accountability on the back end and say who did the bad behavior, whatever, if you can trace it.
Right.
But that's cognitively and whatever people are doing, they're like, that's nice. I already believe this. So yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, before we let you go, I want to ask you for some book recommendations. Okay. So what have you brought for us today?
First one I would say is Tali Sharot, The Influential Mind, because that gives you kind of the neuroscience look and it helps you understand how we are manipulated, how our minds and how we're basically ripe for manipulation and how to understand this space and how this happens, because it happens to all of us, right? And then the second is once we are sort of in this kind of space where we're polarized and we have our bias is Adam Kahane, and he's got a peace building organization. There's not only a Peace Force, Rios Group, there's tons of these organizations, but this guy wrote Collaborating with the Enemy, how to work with people you don't agree with, like, or trust, right? So this is big part of, the effects of all of this information environment is being able to communicate effectively and build bridges so that we can come to some kind of reconciliation or coexist peacefully. And the other person, again, I'm a huge Brene Brown fan, but Dare to Lead. And there's 2 types of leadership that she talks about. And again, she said fear and courage are contagious, and courage is a skill that can be learned. And the armored leadership is what we need to get away from, right? That's where you're using fear to manage. It's more Machiavellian, right?
Yep.
To daring leadership. And it's kind of working together in community, all of the diversity, equity, inclusion, including other perspectives and broadening your aperture and really leading from behind. And that is what I would say. Those 3 books, and there's a bunch others, but those would give you kind of a well-rounded, if you're trying to think about what you can do in this overwhelming, my head explodes 72 times in 30 minutes from how big this problem set is. These give you some bite-sized things that you can bring to your day-to-day life.
Beth, thank you for what has been really a thought-provoking discussion.
You.
Oh my goodness, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think that our audience would agree, and they will be much better for this time together. As we wrap up, remember that informed communities are the bedrock of resilience. Our next stop in this journey continues on April 22nd with our webinar, Competing in the Gray Zone, featuring Dr. Sam Mullins. We'll unpack the complex world of covert aggression and the continuous fight for global stability. Concluding today's session, I'm James Minnich. If today's discussion ignited your interest or provoked thoughts, I encourage you to extend this dialogue to our YouTube forum at DKIAPCSS. Until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.